the Cuban regime has been getting involved in several countries, exporting the evil of communists from Cuba, the terrible practice of violence, repression, human rights violations, and also how the Cuban regime has been taking advantage of the goodwill of several countries and the lack of good healthcare systems, and exporting Cuban doctors, exporting also some spies with the Cuban doctors, and also making a profit, paying just peanuts to this doctor and receiving a high amounts of money with this medical mission, and they call this humanitarian. With us today, it is an honor for Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation to have with us an extraordinary congressman, the Honorable Mario Diaz-Balart, a family who has been fighting for the rights of the Cubans, the rights of the people from Florida, and also who has been there, and Mario has been there also for something that some of us believe that is the right approach, that's being a hang for our budget in the appropriation committee, that our taxpayer money goes to the probably the best causes, and we will have some control about the money that gets into the government and in different programs. He is a Republican. He's a representative from the 25th Congressional District, elected in 2002 after served many years in the state as a state legislator. And he has been serving the southwestern Miami-Dade County, including Hialeah, and active in terms of supporting the voters, supporting his community, but also supporting Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and other countries under terrible oppression by this terrible regime. It is an honor for Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation having a friend like you, and for me, it's an honor to be here with you. Please, the whole expertise from, and also one of the things that I'm going to ask him after that, in 2019, he was one of the ones who were fighting for calling the medical brigade as human trafficking. He's going to talk a little bit about that in our Q&A. Mario, all of you.
Carlos, again, let me first say what a privilege it is to be with you on discussing such an important message and an important issue, and in particular also thank the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, its dedicated staff, and the executive director, Marion Smith, for setting up this really important series, these webinars, to bring attention to the atrocities and oppression that continue to occur as a result of communist tyranny that exists in far too many places in the world. Today's topic is really the Cuban regime's medical missions, which have become, as you just mentioned, both a lucrative human trafficking scheme, which exploits medical professionals in order to line the pockets of the dictatorship and the dictators, and a propaganda tool by which the dictatorship appears to be acting charitably while actually enriching itself and depleting the Cuban people's access to healthcare professionals. They don't have much to start with. So again, it's human trafficking at its worst. And it's obviously hard to come up with accurate numbers because the medical missions are not public, and Cuba, obviously the nature of the regime, again, it's hard to get real information. However, from filed lawsuits, information gathered from human rights groups, and the US State Department work, Carlos, we know a few things. According to the US State Department's 2018 Trafficking in Persons report, the regime in Cuba exported between 34,000 and 50,000 healthcare professionals to more than 60 countries in the so-called medical missions that you mentioned. These arrangements were made through contracts with foreign governments, and in some countries, by the way, with international organizations that were serving as intermediaries. So let's just look at one. Let's look at Brazil's Mais Médicos program. Diplomatic cables and other information now indicate that the Pan American Health Organization, PAHO, a UN-affiliated organization, may have been selected as an intermediary intermediary to avoid Brazil's oversight from the National Congress. This took place under former President Dilma Rousseff's administration. Now, ultimately, an agreement between the Brazilian Ministry of Health and the Cuban Medical Services Trading Corporation, CMS, they signed an agreement solidifying this commercial arrangement, which guarantees the following, which is pretty amazing. Payment to PAHO of a monthly fee, and then PAHO would pay the Cuban regime for the medical services provided by each Cuban doctor serving in Brazil. The Cuban regime would pay each Cuban doctor approximately 25% of the monthly payment received from PAHO, 25%. So again, the Cuban regime would keep approximately 75% of the monthly payments received from PAHO. And there was also a prohibition on Cuban medical professionals seeking employment in Brazil outside of this Brazil-PAHO CMS horrific agreement. But here's another interesting note. The Cuban medical professionals, Carlos, were not the only nationality participating in the Mais Médicos program in Brazil. However, Cuban doctors were the only medical professionals in that program to have their salaries directly garnished by their own government, by the Cuban regime. Other doctors of other nationalities in this program received their full salary, as obviously they're supposed to. In November 2018, Cuba ended the 5-year-old Mais Médicos medical program in Brazil, following the demands from Brazil's then president-elect and new administration to improve the treatment and employment conditions of the Cuban healthcare professionals. There were allegations of coercion, non-payment of wages, withholding of passports, and restrictions on their movements. But here's the interesting thing. Rather than complying with these really basic, universally accepted labor conditions, the regime in Cuba instead preferred to withdraw from Brazil once the true nature of the program was revealed. Again, human trafficking. Just last week, Secretary Pompeo called on PAHO to be more transparent and accountable for its actions in facilitating these trafficking agreements, stating that PAHO must, among other things, explain how it came to be the middleman in a scheme to exploit Cuban medical workers in Brazil, how it came to send $1.3 billion to the Cuban regime, why it did not seek approval of its own executive council to facilitate the agreement. By the way, who approved a potentially illegal agreement, and what it did with the $75 million that it collected for brokering this human trafficking agreement. Between 2013 and 2018, more than 20,000 Cuban medical professionals were trafficked in Brazil and had their salaries garnished, movement restricted, and family visits limited by the Cuban regime. A complaint was filed, by the way, with the International Labor Organization, the ILO, in 2015, arguing that the arrangement between the regime and Cuba and PAHO and the government in Brazil, it violated the Forced Labor Convention of 1930, which Brazil, by the way, ratified in 1959. Also, in November 2018, Cuban healthcare workers filed a class action lawsuit in U.S. District Court against PAHO, alleging that the Cuban regime unlawfully profited from the export of healthcare professionals in this scheme of human trafficking. The plaintiffs, Cuban medical professionals, claim that they were paid 10% or less of the fees that the Brazilian government paid PAHO for their services, while PAHO paid at least 85% to the Cuban dictatorship and again retained a brokerage fee of 5%. So clearly the Cuban medical professionals who were doing the work, caring for the patients, those were the ones who were least compensated in this scheme. The complaint says that Cuba makes about the regime makes about $8 billion annually from these medical missions where they traffic by sending doctors and other healthcare workers to foreign countries. The Cuban authorities, they coerce the Cuban medical professionals to remain in the program. They withhold their passports if they don't participate, if they don't help. They restrict their movement. They use minders to conduct surveillance of these medical professionals. And they threaten to revoke their medical license and even retaliate against their family members in Cuba if the participants leave the program. Or they also, by the way, threaten to impose criminal penalties, exile, and family separations if the participants do not return to Cuba as directed by the dictatorship. But here's the interesting thing, Carlos. The regime itself has stated that Cuban medical professionals who are unwilling to remain in their missions will be unable to return to Cuba, their own homeland, for 8 years. Carlos, again, let me thank the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation for its work. It's important work in reminding the world of the evils of communism. We need this reminder today more than ever. I don't think, younger generations may not be aware of the numerous and the varied ways that communism assaults the dignity of individual human people, whether through suppression of expression and dissent, outlawing independent media, and the confiscation of property. One of communism's many false promises is that it guarantees fairness in the workplace and claims to support the workers' rights. But as the example of the Cuban medical workers makes very, very clear, the communist system in Cuba actually exploits the workers. In practice, the services of the Cuban workers are sold to countries around the world to enrich a brutal, murderous dictatorship that uses those resources to further oppress the Cuban people. And even worse, the regime touts its exploitation as a charity rather than a lucrative business for the dictators, and gains praise around the world for helping countries in need of medical care. As we have discussed here, Cuban medical professionals are not treated with a basic respect for their value and the rights inherent to their humanity. They are trafficked and treated as chattel. It's a vicious cycle that must be broken. I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate with you here today. I'm working, as you know, with colleagues in Congress to not only get the word out, but to make sure that the world understands that this is human trafficking at its worst. It's a way that the regime, again, enriches itself, that the dictator and his cronies enriches itself through this practice of human trafficking, and it has to stop. Appreciate this opportunity, and I look forward to our conversation and taking any questions you might have.
It is clear, it's human trafficking. Your resolution 136 pointed out very clear 1 year ago, more than 1 year ago, and I believe I don't believe in just casualties. It has been a coordinated work from USA, from John Barca, from Trujillo, from U.S. Congress. It has been civil society too involved in exposing this. Because the regime has been defending itself. The regime has been saying they have been investing the money in Cuba. That's why they pay only 10%, because the money goes directly to Cuba. But I don't know. I saw the wife of Diaz-Canel trying to enter in luxury stores in Spain. The Castro family's orgies everywhere. So the money is definitely not in the healthcare system. How is the healthcare system? It is better now in Cuba since because they are investing all this money in Cuba.
No, it's actually tragic. That's one of those false narratives that the regime has put out there, and that some people actually believe. Some want to believe it, but others actually do believe it, and it's false. The reality is that they talk about free healthcare. Well, it's true that the Cuban people are free from healthcare. They have no real healthcare. If you are part of the elite, or if you are a tourist, by the way, there's a separate healthcare system for you. But for the Cuban people, they don't have access to healthcare. I'll tell you how bad it is. That if a Cuban is going to have surgery, he has to bring in his own sheets to the hospital, his own needles, his thread. I'm talking about thread not for the sheets. I'm talking about to sew the patient up after surgery. Their own antiseptics. The Cuban healthcare system doesn't exist for real Cubans, for normal Cubans, and so it's really sad. That's one of those false narratives, like the false narrative that this human trafficking scheme is charitable, and that it's a real positive thing. And some people fall for it. Look, when President Obama was in Havana, in his speech, he talked about that as being a positive thing that the regime is doing. So it's something that some people have, again, either wanted to believe or have believed. And the healthcare situation in Cuba has gotten even worse now with the pandemic. It's tragic. Cubans, by the way, don't have access, as has been reported in the news, to basic hygiene things like soap, like detergents. So, as you know, Carlos, one of the main things to fight COVID is to be able to wash your hands and just basic hygiene. Well, unfortunately, the Cuban people in Cuba don't even have access to that now. And so it's a real tragedy. It's a system that has gotten one of the richest countries in the Caribbean, made it one of the poorest. But again, it's not the only example. I think the most recent example, right, is Venezuela, the richest country in South America 20 years ago, and now one of the poorest, where you have people leaving by the millions because of the conditions in Venezuela, the lack of basic essentials, but also, most importantly, the lack of freedom and the repression. And so again, communism, every place it goes, it destroys those countries. And in the case of Cuba, the few things that they talk about as being positive are just outright lies. There is no healthcare for regular Cubans. Obviously, if you're part of the elite, you just mentioned some of the things that we've seen recently on social media. One of Castro's grandkids, right, on a yacht, traveling on this huge yacht. That's communism. That's equality. That's what they profess. Look, communism is just a way to steal from everybody and just have a few at the top have all the spoils. And Cuba is a horrible example of that.
Yeah, I would love that the people that have been promoting this medical mission for the Nobel Prize just give me the 90% of their salaries to me. So it's just a contribution. Right. So hey, give me 90% of your salary or your income. Let me use your house in the lake in Vermont. So I gotta be happy with that. I gotta be happy with your house in the beach.
Well, Carlos, to your point, though, you would think that they would first at least speak with the doctors, the folks who are on the field, the folks who are doing the work, the folks who are exported, trafficked, who again barely get paid if they get paid at all. You would think that they would talk to them about, hey, how was your situation, right? What a great program it is. How are you treated? They would hear from them, as we are hearing now in the court system in the United States, the truth. These are, in essence, people who are treated as quasi-slaves, who are, threatened, who don't have any options. And when they have an opportunity, you know what they do, Carlos? They defect to freedom. Talk to them. Talk to those doctors who are also victimized by this human trafficking scheme that the regime, again, profits from and uses those profits to further repress the Cuban people in the island.
Yeah, no. In fact, there's a question from the public about this petition from an actor who has been tied to the Venezuelan regime, and of course they pay him $17 million for a movie that never came about Haiti. And what is that about us? Do you think that this medical mission deserve a Nobel Prize because of their humanitarian work?
No, what it deserves is the recognition of what it is: human trafficking. It's in essence modern day slavery. It's repression at its worst. And again, it's hard to believe that in this day and age, when now finally the information is out, again, look at what we know from Brazil. Look what we know from these lawsuits. It's hard to believe that anybody would be confused and anybody would think that that is anything other than what it is, which is, again, utilizing people, not at their free choice, exporting them to places where they don't want to go, and then in essence, paying them very little, if anything at all, because what we've heard now, what we know now, is that the regime will pay them even less than what they signed that they would pay. So again, it's human trafficking blatantly at its worst. I am so grateful, by the way, for the work that this administration, the U.S. administration, is doing. You mentioned some amazing public servants who are exposing the truth. And again, all they're showing are the facts. They're asking for the facts, and when they're getting them, they're putting them out there, and the facts prove what anybody who has actually scratched the surface a little bit can readily see, that this is human trafficking, and this is a horrific, horrific situation that has to end, and that's why exposing it is so important.
Yeah, what they have been doing is exposing facts, as you say. Yeah. The contract with the medical doctors in Mexico reflects that they only receiving 10% of the money, and the rest of the money goes directly to the government of Cuba. That's a contract. That is nothing. They're signing a blank contract, and then we found the contract that the government of Cuba signed with some of the entities in Mexico, and that reflects a different kind of payment.
Well, again, because there's no rule of law, obviously, in Cuba. Yep. There's no transparency. It is hard to believe that the government in Mexico would agree just to those standards that are basically public, right? And we all know that the reality is even worse than that, but they would agree to that. It's in violation of every international labor norm. It really is. And so, again, it's hard to believe. It's not, unfortunately, we're seeing that the government in Mexico is also trying to help the dictatorship in Venezuela. And that's unfortunate. But I will tell you, Carlos, and this is really important, they're doing this at great risk. They're doing this at great risk. The United States does not look kindly anymore at when there are these huge violations of human rights, huge violation of basic principles. Mexico now doing this, whether it's supporting this human trafficking system that the Cuban regime has been using for so many years, or also supporting the dictatorship in Venezuela, is not something that the government in the United States is going to look at kindly. And I think I would caution our friends in Mexico not to think that they can act absolutely irresponsibly with impunity.
Yeah, we were just commenting that they are sacrificing dollars to invest just some pennies or to lose pennies with this regimes that are not going to support anything. And if the people of Mexico deserve something better than supporting with their own taxes this kind of regimes. Your resolution last year, envisioning the whole human trafficking, at that time, a common agenda from the administration, common agenda from civil society for the international people that care about Cuba, and now the potential bill, this Senate proposal from Scott, Rubio, and Cruz. Congress, what is the role of Congress? How do you envision the next step in Congress?
Carlos, again, the facts are coming out, and so it's hard to hide those facts anymore. And by the way, let me. You mentioned those in the Senate. Let me mention my dear friend, who I am just such a huge admirer of, Albiocides in the House, who I'm working with this with, and he's just, he's a freedom fighter. Where there's repression anywhere in the world, you can count on Albiocides to stand up. And so, yeah, you're seeing Congress now starting to act in a real positive way. Again, fighting against human trafficking, fighting against something that it sounds good, right? Oh, these medical missions that are helping people in need. That's not what it is. It's human trafficking. And by the way, going back to what we said about we talking about Mexico. One of the things that we have to note is that slavery is profitable. When you barely have to pay or you don't pay at all, that's profitable, but it doesn't make it right. And again, there will be consequences. And so you're starting to see, going back to your specific question about what Congress is doing, you're starting to see that Congress is not only waking up to this, but I think you're going to see more and more actions to fight, stop, and to hold people accountable for when they commit acts of human trafficking. Congress has acted in the past on issues of human trafficking. This is coming to light now, and I think you're going to see further action.
Well, there is precisely a comment here that wants to get informed of somebody is telling us that while the Cuban regime is sending doctors in to support other government abroad, the cousin of these people just died last week in Havana because the hospital refused to operate her, and probably she will be alive if the regime will invest that money from the profit they are making, billions of dollars with these Cuban doctors. And it's back to the point that they are not investing this money internally in Cuba.
No, you're absolutely right. First place, they're not investing in Cuba. They're investing in the repression and in the dictator and his family. Second part, though, that you mentioned is so true, which is that if you happen to be an opposition leader, I already talked about how regular Cubans don't have access to real healthcare. I mean, the healthcare is dismal at best. But if you are an opposition leader or a family member of an opposition leader, they frankly don't even let you in sometimes into the hospital. So it's horrible. And the third thing, which is really important, and I think this is important to note, and you've talked about this, Carlos, the regime, it doesn't matter how much money it gets, it doesn't invest in the people. It invests in itself, in the repression, in the family of the dictators. but it also has done something else. Think about when the regime had a lot more money, when the Soviet Union was in essence funding the regime in Cuba. Were the Cuban people better off? Was their healthcare system great? Was there more freedom? No. You know what they were doing with that money? They were sending troops to places like Africa and Latin America. They were trying to export their form of tyranny, their form of repression around the planet. Now, it was a serious national security threat to the United States and to, frankly, countries around. I was about to say in our hemisphere, but no. Look at the damage that they did in Africa. Even that's what the regime does when it has a lot of money. When it has less money, nothing really changes for the Cuban people because they don't get anything anyways. But they're not able to export, again, the tyranny that as much as aggressively as they had when they had more money. Having said that, I will tell you that this regime in Havana, like the regime in Caracas and in Managua, they represent a clear threat to the national security interests of the United States, not to mention that they're a horrific threat and damaging to their own people.
Yep, that's precisely a fan of you, Ravi Weberman. This person wrote a message to you, of course, praising your good work. But this person is concerned about the work of Venezuela and Cuba here in the U.S. Supporting some of the violent movement. So I don't know if you can comment of that or not. You don't have to, but this person just want to let you know that this person is concerned about that.
By the way, if it's the Rabbi Weberman that I know, and I think it may be, that is one of the most amazing families that I know. Rabbi Weberman was a dear friend of my father's, and that whole family are dear friends of mine. And so a big shout out to the rabbi and his amazing family. Here's what should not surprise us. We know, because we've seen it in whether it's the WASP network or other espionage cases, or Ana Belén Montes, who's probably one of the most damaging spies to hurt the national security interests of the United States. She was working in defense intelligence for many, many years, and she was a spy for the Cuban regime. So it should not surprise us that they have a lot of operatives in the United States. And also Venezuela also has operatives in the United States. It should also not surprise us that whenever and however they can, when they can do damage, they will do it. They will help incite violence. They will do espionage. They will do whatever they can. So we've seen reports. So I'm going to talk about open reports because I'm obviously can't talk about anything else. Open reports in the press where Venezuelans or Cubans were detained for participating and potentially instigating violence and again, in some of the rioting taking place in the United States. That should not surprise us because that's in essence their LMO. That's what they do. That's what they know how to do.
So, and there's another question here. It's the average American doesn't know about what's going on in Cuba, and I have to be honest. There's some kind of discrimination against the people, the Cuban people, because we believe that the island is just an ideological thing, and nobody cares about what the people in Cuba has been feeling or how they have been surviving the 60 some years of this regime. Same with the people of Venezuela. But what this person is worried about, how we can do to inform the American people, what specific steps individual can take to support Cuba. There's a direct question here.
It's a very good question because obviously there's not a lot of press coverage that comes out of Cuba showing anything other than what they call the quaint old cars, as if that was a positive thing. And when was the last time we saw a news report coming out of Cuba about the political prisoners, about the situation in the hospitals? You don't see that. And by the way, if a reporter decides to actually do that, then obviously they throw he or she out. And that's the last time that they will report. So therefore, you're seeing that in essence, there's auto-censorship by the few international reporters that are actually in Cuba. And that's a shame. So what can we do? First is just get the facts out and talk about the facts. And so that's why, by the way, Congressman Diaz-Balart and I have this resolution to bring out just the facts. The more people look at the facts, the more people see the reality, not the falsehoods that have come out for the 60 years of propaganda coming from the regime in Cuba. Frankly, people are appalled. Look, normal people, every particular Americans, by the way, who I think are the most amazing people on the planet, when they see the facts, when they see the oppression, when they see the horrors that the Cuban people go through, when they see how the people are treated there, when they see the folks are incarcerated for dangerousness, when they see that independent journalists are thrown in prison and get sentences, well, in some cases death, and then maybe they might be lucky if that death sentence is changed to life imprisonment or 25 years. And so that happens routinely in Cuba. When the American people see that, they're appalled. And so what do? Get the word out. The more that people hear the facts, the better it is. And one of the ways to do that, by the way, is through social media, utilizing our individual social media accounts to just post what's going on. I've had the privilege of speaking with people inside Cuba, heroes of mine, opposition leaders who have suffered greatly. And the story is the same. The repression continues. The beatings of political prisoners, the repression, the horrors, the lack of treating people with human dignity has not gotten better. It continues. It's the same regime. And for the national security interests of the United States, that danger persists. And we're seeing it because we're looking at what's going on in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, and other parts of this hemisphere. Again, it's not only bad for the people in Cuba, but it's a threat to the national security interests of the United States, as I said before.
Yeah, when people believe that socialism and communism is good for the U.S. and nobody remember, people try to fight against the history, destroy the history because they don't want to remember how communism has been destroyed. I just want to promote a little bit of the work of BOC. We have been doing that. We have been going state by state, talking about communism, talking about the risk, bringing that. And also we have been promoting the work of several great leaders from Cuba. Recently, we gave one of our major award to Jose Daniel Ferrer. What do you think about Jose Daniel Ferrer? He's a major leader and the Damas de Blanco. Let's talk a little bit about people who's fighting in Cuba. I know that you have been supporting them. So let's talk a little bit about them.
Well, Carlos, by the way, and I would be remiss if I didn't once again, as I said at the beginning, just thank the work that your group is doing. An amazing work, important work, historic work of historic proportions. I mentioned at the beginning, but I can never say it enough. You mentioned Jose Daniel Ferrer. I had a conversation, by the way, on video with him done through from the IRI, where he and I talked for, I don't know, maybe 40 minutes on a video conference. He from Cuba, and I was here in the United States, and I was able to ask him about his conditions. This is an individual, by the way, who is just an independent journalist who has tried to show the facts, who realized pretty early on that the regime was frankly just unacceptable and horrific. And for that, he was one of the 75 in the Black Spring, La Primavera Negra, he was arrested and incarcerated by the regime. I believe he was first given a death sentence and then given a sentence of like 35 years or life. Eventually, that was shortened. He was released just recently. But by the way, when I say released into house arrest, he's still imprisoned in Cuba. And one of my heroes, by the way, a person who continues the fight for freedom in a peaceful, but frankly, very patriotic and brave way. You mentioned Las Damas de Blancos. Las Damas de Blanco, by the way, are Sakharov Prize winners by the European Parliament. So they're recognized internationally. These are women whose husband or brothers or fathers, sons have been imprisoned, are political prisoners in Castro's Cuba. And so what they do on Sunday is they dress in white and they march to church. And that the regime sees as an act of disobedience and a threat to them. And by the way, so they've suffered from beatings, literally. They go and they beat them up, they drag them in the streets. One of their founders was murdered by the Castro regime. Again, amazing heroes, these women, recognized around the world as who they are. And yet there are some who still talk about, the quaint old cars, the healthcare system in Cuba, which does not exist for real Cubans, who continue to repeat the lies that have time and time again been proven to be just that, falsehoods, lies, despite the fact that the reality is so much different. And all it takes is to scratch the surface to see the real truth about the suffering of the Cuban people. Those who dare to speak out are imprisoned, are beaten up, or in essence thrown or forced into exile. And so you just mentioned Jose Daniel, and you mentioned the ladies in white, but you can talk about, Dr. Oscar Elias Bisset. We can go on for days mentioning the names of these heroes, many of whom have been imprisoned, some who are still in prison, who receive beatings and psychological torture just because they ask for one simple thing: freedom and human dignity for the Cuban people.
Yep. I also have a friend of yours and his best, Grant Wernick, and he just asked openly what else we can do. There's, despite all the preventive measures, there's any strategy for the ones that wants to abandon this program, that defect from this terrible human trafficking program from the regime. Are we willing to offer asylum? Let me first answer a little bit about this. We're trying, BOC is trying in Mexico to, well, we already hired some lawyers to support the Cuban doctors. They are in Mexico to help them to see what are their alternatives. But do you have any advice, Mary?
Look, and again, thank the VOC for the job that you're doing. As I mentioned before, I've mentioned a bunch of times, but I'm going to say it more often because it's important to mention. It is. Look, you asked what are the options. During Bush the second, George W. Bush's presidency, a group of us met with the president and his team. Then Congressman Lincoln Diaz-Balart, Congresswoman Ileana Ross-Layton, myself. We worked with other people like Bob Menendez, who's a U.S. Senator from New Jersey. And a number of us, frankly, met and were talking to the White House and came up with a program then to give, in essence, asylum to those medical professionals who were trafficked by the Castro regime in other countries. If they could come to a U.S. consulate someplace, they were processed and then they were allowed to come to the United States. And by the way, their family members who are under 21 would also be allowed to come to the United States. And thousands upon thousands did. It was a very, very successful program. It helped them. Interesting, it also helped the United States because these were medical professionals who all came to the United States and have been doing great work in the United States. And now, this is the unfortunate part. As one of the many gifts that the President Obama's administration, President Obama, gave to Castro, was eliminating that program. Think about that. A program that was giving, in essence, asylum to folks who were being trafficked, human trafficked by the Castro regime, a program that was working, that we saw the results and could talk to those who benefited, who were trafficked and were now in the United States. And yet, President Obama, as one of the many gifts that he gave to the Castro regime, unilaterally, by the way, asking nothing in return, was the elimination of that program. It's something that we are looking at, hopefully, bringing back one day, and we're in communication with the administration. Now, I will tell you this, the administration has been phenomenal in dealing with the national security threat that is the Castro regime or the regime in Venezuela and in Nicaragua. You're seeing constantly additional sanctions, pressure being put on the regimes, pressure being put on those countries that have been helping and have been profiting, by the way, from the slave labor in Cuba or in Venezuela or in Nicaragua. And so the Trump administration has been really, really good. Every day they're doing more. And we've seen that now with what I just mentioned a little while ago with the Secretary of State bringing up the issue of human trafficking. So they've done an amazing amount of really, really good work, fully implementing the Helms-Burton bill, including Title III, Article 3. So they've done an amazing job, and we continue to work with them on to do more, because it's pretty clear. You don't hurt a regime by helping to fund them and giving them legitimacy, which is what, unfortunately, the previous administration in the White House did. What you should do is show solidarity not with the regime, but with the people, and pressure the regime. And that's exactly what this administration, the Trump administration, is doing in the case of Cuba, of Venezuela, of Nicaragua. It's standing with the people of those countries, not with the regimes that repress them. And by the way, you're going to see more activity and more action and more pressure coming from the Trump administration.
Well, and I know that we're gonna maybe deviate a little bit, but there's a specific questions about Maduro's recent actions against the political parties and the increase of depression and the fake election that the regime has been organizing or will organize in a matter of 2 or 3 months. Do you have any specific response to that? How will the U.S. Congress respond to Maduro's action to rig the December 2020 elections?
Well, look, the good news is that nobody's confused in the United States. When I say nobody, there are those who want to be confused, as I mentioned, those who will always find an excuse to help these anti-American dictatorships. But for the most part, in the United States, people are not confused. In the United States Congress, the majority is not confused, and clearly in the administration, nobody is confused about what the Maduro regime is doing. Nobody thinks that anything that they're doing is legitimate or legal. There is a legitimate and legal government in Venezuela, and that's the provisional government of President Guaido. And so the important thing is to continue to pressure, to express solidarity with the people of Venezuela, with the elected constitutional government of Venezuela. So as long as we don't have a change in the United States, it decides to do what the previous administration in the White House did, which was to go out of its way to help the regime in Venezuela, in Cuba. As long as that doesn't happen, I think what you're going to see again is more pressure and, again, no confusion from the United States. And I will also have to say this. There is very strong bipartisan support in Congress when it comes to an understanding of the reality of the situation in Venezuela. Here in South Florida, where I live and represent, we have one of the champions among the Democrats in Congress on the issue of, by the way, not only Venezuela, but Cuba and Nicaragua. That's Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Her and I have a million differences. But I will tell you, when it comes to the cause of freedom, for the Cuban people, for the Venezuelan people, for the Nicaraguan people, we are one. We speak as one voice. And so, again, as I tell you, there's very little confusion in Congress. There's no confusion in this administration, in the White House. So I don't think we should be too concerned about that. What you're going to continue to see is stronger solidarity, more action taking place to help the Cuban people free themselves from this nightmare, because, again, that confusion is not there as long as we keep, again, the pressure.
So it looks like the regime, like China and so other authoritarians, has been taking advantage of the COVID-19. Venezuela has been imposing curbside and destroying whatever was there in terms of mobilization. Nicaragua to Cuba, also the same thing. But the Cuban regime has been taking advantage of the COVID-19 to send a medical brigade to South Africa, to Italy, to Mexico, offering to send to Argentina. There are even crazy people asking for some medical brigades for the US and for Canada. So how we can stop that? It looks like all the work that we were doing before the pandemic, before the crisis, helping some governments to realize that these were bad things for the Cuban people, they suddenly has been allowing to freely export these missions around the world. How can we do to stop this?
Look, again, I think the United States will and can and will do more to pressure and to highlight the nature of this program, as we saw in Brazil. That's key. But also, Carlos, let's not be confused. There are some who have always looked at every way to justify and to help the Castro regime. And a lot of those are the same usual suspects. You mentioned a couple of countries. You mentioned, we mentioned Canada. It's not Canada. It's Trudeau, right? Remember when the dictator Fidel Castro died? What the words of Prime Minister Trudeau, frankly, praising the dictator in Cuba. And so I'm not surprised by the fact that there are some who look for any excuse to help bail out, to apologize with the Castro regime. It's the same dictatorship, by the way, that it's been for over 60 years. And then there are others who just may not know. And you're absolutely right. The Castro regime sees as a potential profit point. The situation is tough around the world. They don't care about what happens to their own people. So they will export the medical professionals around the world, because all this is a way for that regime in Havana to make more money for themselves, for them to be able to get bigger yachts, to be able to do more of what they do, travel around the world. And I don't know how many gold Rolexes the Castro family and kids can have, but obviously they seem to have a monopoly on them. To do that, but also to stay in control, to stay in power, to utilize those funds not to help the people in Cuba, but to help themselves stay in power, to repress the people further, because their other options are drying out, which is interesting. Their other options are drying out. They were depending on Venezuelan money, oil that was stolen from the Venezuelan people, and there was being sent to the Cuban regime. That's been drying up, and so now they see this as a potential revenue source, and that's all it is. They're desperate for revenue sources. They see it as potential revenue sources. It is sad, however, Carlos, that there are some who are usually the same ones that we always hear about, who always go out of their way to try to help, to try to apologize, to try to defend what is indefensible, which is human trafficking in this case.
So you mentioned the regime use of these resources. So that means there's a something there that has been mentioned by Otaola, other influencers about the corruption. People in Cuba has been sending photos about the hospitals, about the health situation in Cuba, about the lifestyle of the people from the regime, the houses, and when they travel, they have been following them. There's any resolution or anything in progress to just expose the corruption in Cuba? That's a new thing, because nobody wants to talk about this. There's any potential resolution or any engagement from Congress to expose the corruption from the terrible Cuban regime?
And you're right. It's actually a different level of corruption. Communism allows for a different level of corruption than any other type of dictatorship. It really does, because you have dictators. Obviously, I don't like dictatorships. I don't care if they're from the right, from the left. To me, dictatorships are unacceptable and should always be condemned whenever possible. But in the case of communism, you'll have dictators that, for example, will confiscate a business or that will do sleazy deals. In the case of communism, all the properties are confiscated. Every single business is owned by the dictatorship. Every property is owned by the dictatorship. And not only properties, frankly, as we've seen by this human trafficking that they do with the medical professionals, even individuals are owned by the dictatorship. So again, it's corruption at a different level. And that's why it shouldn't surprise anybody when, I think it was Forbes, right? When they put their list of the wealthiest people in the world, they had put Fidel Castro as one of the wealthiest people in the world. And I don't remember if in those days it was $500 million or $1 billion. But the reality, that's just a drop in the bucket, because the entire island was confiscated by the Castro brothers, by the Castro family, and they own everything. They own every cow, they own every toothpick, they own every tree, every business, and every doctor and medical professional. And they use them, again, they export them at a whim just to have more revenue for themselves, for their families, to be able to live really, really well. And again, it's really funny, right? When you see these socialists or these communists that are, air-conditioned communists, right? They have yachts, they have gold watches, but they profess that everybody should not have anything, and then they profess their hatred of property, and yet they have all the property, they own all the property, they steal everything, and we can do more, and that's a good point, and so we will do more to try to expose the truth of the amazing corruption that communism allows, and you see that, by the way, anywhere and everywhere when communism takes over. And I would add that socialism, by the way, in many cases allows that to happen as well. It's a great avenue for that as well.
Yeah, when people see the wife of the greatest leader, Diaz-Canel, trying to buy a purse for $2,000, $3,000 in a store in Spain. By the way, she left the country under false pretension of a change kind of mission to Spain. But whatever, this is the time to expose this kind of reality from Cuba, and maybe that's something that we need to continue doing. There's some people saying that, well, we have to have these programs in Spanish too, but this is a time to educate also to the U.S. Viewers, the youth groups in the U.S., the dangers of communists, the dangers of a regime like Cuba, and getting engaged in that. Do you think that education needs to be a factor here in the U.S., how we can educate about what's going on there?
Yeah, absolutely, which is why the role that you all play, VOC plays, is so fundamental, so essential. Always has been, but as I said at the beginning, I think never more important than now. I think there's a lot of lack of understanding as to, a lot of people think, oh, communism doesn't exist anymore. It sure does for the people of Cuba, the people of North Korea. I mean, the people of China. And so, and again, it's horrific. The human rights violations, the human trafficking, institutionalized, by the way. This is institutionalized. It's not that it just happens. It's that the regime itself is the one who is doing the human trafficking. In the case of the Cuban regime, with what they do with again, medical professionals. They don't only do it, by the way, with medical professionals, but that's the one that's been the most lucrative for the regime in Cuba. And you mentioned Diaz-Canel's wife, buying thousands of dollars for one purse. And we have to also remember that Diaz-Canel isn't even Castro, isn't part of the family. Diaz-Canel is a lightweight, third-rate figurehead of that dictatorship. He is the Dorticos de turno. He's the Dorticos de jour, right? Dorticos, for those that won't remember, Dorticos, nobody remembers it. Even in Cuba, by the way, I talked to folks on the island, and they don't remember who that was either. Dorticos was president of Cuba. It's going to surprise a lot of people. For was it, Carlos, I think 16 or 17 years when Fidel Castro was still alive. And so the reason nobody remembers him is because he was totally just inconsequential. Everybody knew he was a fake figurehead. Diaz-Canel is the Dorticos now. And so, but even a figurehead, his wife, travels the world, goes to Europe to buy, $1,000 in purses. And that's communism for you. You see, communism from the dictators and their cronies is for everybody else, not for them. Because for them, they travel in yachts. They have huge parties. They have gold watches and designer clothes while they profess, and they dictate for everybody else that they can't have anything because it's for the good of the people, for the rest of the people that basically starve. Look, communism is a farce. It is the epitome of corruption, and you are absolutely right that we have to do more. And I look forward to working with you and VOC to do more, and again, exposing the corruption that is inherent in that system. I was going to say system of government. No, system of repression and of corruption and of taking advantage of, frankly, the people that they destroy.
You have been right to expose the massive human traffic enterprise. It's not only the doctors, it's also the sexual workers in Cuba, right, voted by the Canadians and other tourists that go to Cuba for this kind of tourists, and openly they accept that. The educators, the trainers, it's a massive business. And also people that also go to Cuba to receive training in terms of being a doctor, people from Honduras, from Uruguay, traveling to Cuba to also give money to the Cuban regime. This is massive. It is only doctors, or it's massive human traffic.
It is. It's billions upon billions of dollars. I mean, I think the lawsuit says, I believe it's about $8 billion a year. And that's just a part of it. And you're absolutely right about sexual human trafficking and the sexual trade. Not only, by the way, on the island, but they also export. There are restaurants around the world that are deals between the Cuban regime and some business owner. They exist in Spain. They exist elsewhere around the world. And then the regime exports, by the way, their workers. And they are treated, in essence, in the same kind of way that the medical professionals are treated, which is that they barely get paid. They are treated horrifically. In many cases, not only are they basically not paid, but they're also then sexually abused. And yet, Again, it's a very, very profitable. Human trafficking is very profitable, and it's exceedingly profitable for the dictatorship in Havana. And again, as I mentioned before, this is institutionalized by the regime as a profit venture for them to make the money, and then they use that money for their own personal, pleasure, but also to keep themselves in power and continue to keep this vicious circle of repression and of corruption.
Congressman, it has been an honor for me to moderate this discussion. We learned a lot, and for us at the BOC, it is an honor, and we want to continue working with you and joining this effort. We are here to continue battling and joining forces with Department of State, with Barca USA, with you, with everyone who needs support to continue the battle. In the name of the Victims of Communism Foundation, thank you for your extraordinary presentation, for your work, and for all the viewers. Thank you for being here. This presentation will be available also in YouTube. Please promote us and help us to raise the voice and continue this. So, Mario, you have the last 2 minutes just for you. No interruption to say the last words. Thank you very much.
Well, look, thank you for again allowing me this opportunity for the job that you do, and the VOC. The VOC's role has never been so important. It has been sometimes a lonesome road from VOC, but every day, the work that you do again exposes the reality of the suffering of communism. Not only the murders, the millions of people that communism has killed in the past, but the fact that it continues to do so today. And there are people that are still struggling, still suffering under this repressive system. And again, we must speak out. VOC is on the forefront of that. Thank you for the job that you do. It is a privilege to work with you. And thank you for this opportunity to spend some minutes with you today.
Thank you very much. Next week, we're going to have OA Secretary General Almagro also sharing with us some views. Thank you, Mario. Thank you for all your hard work. Thank you to everyone. In the name of VOC, thank you for being here with us today.